Hello, welcome back to the Vintage Model Company. This video will show you how to build your own Balsa Basics Cub. This is a new video which details the construction method of the version 2 Cub that includes some upgrades over the previous version. The first version was great, but could be brought closer to perfection with a few subtle improvements. These improvements include a much stronger nose, a stronger wing, a new tail skid, wheel fairings, and additional details. Make sure to set up your electronics before this build so that you have them ready for later. Test them and set them aside. The first thing I like to do on a build is to pop out all of the laser cut components from the sheet balsa wood. I find this speeds up the build, however you can locate and assemble as you go. Starting with the fuselage, build up the motor and battery mount. Identify the 5 plywood pieces that make up the motor and battery mount, and also the 4 supplied M3 captive T-nuts. Push the T-nuts into the rear of the plywood motor mount at the correct mounting locations. Now you can dry assemble the motor mount with the captive nuts facing rearwards together with the 2 plywood side pieces onto the battery tray followed by the top. Make sure to build this assembly on a flat surface and ensure that all of the tabs are correctly and fully inserted into their relative slots. Once satisfied, wick some CA cyano glue into all of the seams and joints and hold it together until the glue has set. Next, bend and mount the undercarriage wire. You can do this by locating the 14 gauge wire and using a ruler to mark off the following distances, measuring from one end. Make a mark at 25mm, and then from that 25mm mark, make a mark at 139mm, and then another 139mm, and finally 25mm. Now you can cut the wire to length at the final mark, and at the centre mark, bend the wire to an angle of about 95 degrees with a pair of pliers. Next, bend each of the ends to create the horizontal axles. Now you can bind the undercarriage wire to the plywood former using some thread. You can either apply cyano or 2-part epoxy to this thread to solidify it, making it all rock solid. Next is the fuselage assembly. Locate the 4 long balsa pieces that make up the 2 fuselage sides. On a flat surface, assemble one fuselage side by joining an upper fuselage part to the lower fuselage part. Holding the 2 parts together firmly on the table, wick some glue along the length of the joint and hold in place until the glue has set. Repeat this process on the other fuselage side. Locate the plywood former with a V shape at the top and also the servo tray. Place one fuselage side onto the table and dry assemble the motor and battery mount box constructed earlier. Now the tool former can fit into the middle vertical slots and the servo tray into the horizontal slot just forward of the tool former. Ensure that all of these parts are correctly located and fully square before wicking CA into the joints and slots. You can also insert the undercarriage former into the angled slot on the fuselage side, ensuring that the undercarriage wire faces forwards. Assemble the second fuselage side onto the motor and battery box, the formers and servo tray, ensuring that all the tabs are fitted properly into their correct slots. Check that the sides are square and aligned with each other, and then wick some glue into all of the joints and slots to hold everything together, and then wait until the glue has fully set. Locate the rear plywood former and the balsa triangular tailplane mounting base. Dry assemble the plywood former into the rear vertical slots on the fuselage side and then bring the 2 fuselage sides together, making sure that the former tabs are inserted correctly into their respective slots on both sides. Insert the tailplane mounting base into the rear of the fuselage. Ensure that the fuselage sides are aligned and square and that the tabs on the rear former and tailplane mounting base are fully honed before wicking some glue into all of the joints and the slots at the rear of the fuselage. Now you can locate the balsa nose reinforcement doublers and stick them to each side of the inside of the fuselage nose area. This will add a lot of strength to this part of the aircraft. At this point you can insert a length of battery strap if you want to. Now you can install the motor and electronics. Although it is possible to fit the electronics right at the end of the build, meaning that you can swap them from one plane to another, it's a bit easier to do it now while the electronics tray is exposed. Screw the motor onto the plywood motor mount, making sure that the screws are tightened fully into the captive T-nuts. We recommend using a small amount of thread lock to keep them tight. Route the motor wires through the hole in the motor mount and connect them to the electronic speed controller in the correct order. Stick the ESC to the bottom of the plywood battery mount and then pass the ESC battery lead through the hole at the front of the battery tray. Pass the ESC power lead through the undercarriage former hole and connect it to the receiver. Screw the servos onto the servo tray, making sure that the servos have been centered and that the servo arms are pointing towards the center line of the fuselage. Connect the servos to the receiver so that the rudder servo is on the right hand side and the elevator servo is on the left. Connect your receiver, power up your transmitter and connect the battery to the ESC to check that everything works. Whatever you do, don't have your prop on while testing your electronics. The servo should be centered and your motor should turn in the right direction. Disconnect the battery and locate the 2 wire push rods. Pass the wire through the holes at the rear of the fuselage and connect them to the push rod connectors on the servos. Lightly tighten up these linkages using the screws to hold them temporarily in place. Locate the top rear decking parts, this is the shorter of the 2 long parts, and dry assemble the decking onto the fuselage. Hold in place while wicking some CA glue into the joints and make sure it's nice and secure. Find the lower rear underside sheeting and dry assemble this onto the rear underside of the fuselage. Once satisfied, you can glue it in place. Now you can find the small piece that connects the undercarriage former to the rear underside sheeting. Ensuring that the sheeting is pressed up against the fuselage sides, wick some CA glue into the joints to secure it in place. Next, you can fit the cowling piece. One of the final parts is the windscreen, so locate it and trial fit it in place. You might need to bevel the edge with sandpaper where it meets the fuselage cowling piece to ensure a good fit. Stick the windscreen into place and now use sandpaper to lightly round off all of the corners on the fuselage and lightly sand the rest of the fuselage to produce a smooth finish ready for covering. Moving on to the tail parts, locate the fin and rudder components. Slots for the mylar hinges need to be cut into the trailing edge of the fin and the leading edge of the rudder. Using the lines as a guide, use a sharp knife to carefully cut the slots into the edges of both the fin and rudder to a depth of approximately 12mm. Test the hinges and then carefully sand a bevel on the trailing and leading edges of the fin and rudder, aiming to produce a point along the middle of the edges, in line with the hinge slots that have been cut. Round off the other edges of the fin and rudder and then give the surfaces a light sanding to create a smooth finish. Do check that the mylar hinges fit, but don't glue them in at this stage. Now moving on to the horizontal stabilizer, you can assemble the tailplane and elevators using the plywood elevator joiner. Slots for the mylar hinges need to be cut into the trailing edge of the tailplane and into the leading edges of the elevators, just as you've done on the rudder. Moving on to your wing, set out your wing parts, including the plywood main spar, the doublers, the balsa rear spar, the leading and trailing edges, the ribs and the wingtips. Dry assemble the wing like so. Insert one rib into the slot at the end of the plywood main spar and another at the second from the middle slot. Locate the balsa rear spar and slot the 2 assembled ribs into the rear spar along with the wingtip. Install the 5 remaining ribs, taking care to position them correctly. Keeping the assembly nice and flat, locate and slot the leading and trailing edges onto the ribs and to the wingtip. Carefully insert the balsa main spar doubler into the slots on the ribs to the rear of the plywood spar and into the slot on the wingtip. Keep the spar level when inserting to prevent breakage. Check that the parts are fully seated into their respective slots and that the wing is square before applying adhesive to the joints between the ribs and spars, leading and trailing edges and the wingtip. Finally, wick glue along the joint between the plywood and balsa spar and hold in position until it is fully set. Repeat the process for the opposite wing panel to complete the wing. Finally, locate the last wing rib, which is cut from thicker balsa than the rest, and slot it into the center position. As with the other assemblies, give the wings a light sanding to round off the edges and to remove any glue lumps. Once you have covered the aircraft with your chosen covering method, see our other videos for in-depth tutorials. You can lay out your parts and get to work assembling them into the finished plane. Remove the covering from the slot on the rear underside of the fuselage to glue in place the plywood tail skid. Cut 2 lengths of dowel to 105mm long, remove the covering from the dowel holes and insert the dowels so that they are equal on each side. Stick them in place with cyano adhesive. Now you can open up the slits on the stabilizers and the elevator and rudder parts to reinsert the mylar hinges. Wick some glue around the hinges, allowing it to flow deep into the wood. Viscous glue like Rocket Hot really works wonders here. Move the control surfaces around a little as it dries though, just to make sure it doesn't dry rock solid. Now you can slot the vertical stabilizer through the horizontal stabilizer, gluing it in place before gluing the sub-assembly to the tail. Mount the wheels to the undercarriage axles using wheel collets if supplied. Now you will need to install the control horns. Cut away the covering and slot one into the rudder. Install the linkage and tighten up the screw to have it grasp the push rod. You can adjust this later during setup if necessary. We recommend using the middle hole for standard control throws. Cut off the excess wire and then repeat the process on the elevator control horn. The elevator push rod may need to be angled slightly to allow you to mount the linkage with the screw in place where it is accessible for adjustments. There are markings available on the downloadable written instructions sheet that can be found on our website and used to decorate your model. On the sheet there are also templates for optional undercarriage fairings. These can be made from scrap balsa or card and attached with covering material. Lastly, it's probably a good idea to stick a strip of self-adhesive Velcro onto the battery tray. Another strip can be stuck onto the battery. With that, your Cub is finished. Congratulations. All that remains is for you to properly set it up ready for a first flight. To learn how to do that, including balancing, control adjustments and flight tips, make sure to watch our Balsa Basics Cub setup guide. Thanks very much for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed building your Cub and best of luck with the maiden flight. Subscribe for more, like this video if you enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next one.
Successful. Excellent.